Conscient Podcast Episode 155. Novelist, playwright, poet, and essayist Sanita Fejzić.
I think artists can challenge us by, like I said, showing our blind spots, in a way educating us, but also inspiring us about what's possible, right? I think in Scale we talk about reauthoring the world. That's what artists do. We reauthor the world. We create alternative ways of even just thinking about what's desirable in the first place.
I first met Sanita in 2021 while we were both on the mission circle of Scale, the Sectoral Climate Arts Leadership for the Emergency Organization. And we had great debates, Sanita and I, about climate justice and the role of art in the climate emergency and much more. And you'll hear some of those exchanges and ideas today. I also had the pleasure of doing sound design in 2023 for a series of plays that Sanita produced called Why Worry About Their Futures? And you can imagine what that was about. It was produced by the Undercurrents Festival here on the unceded land of the Anishinaabe and Algonquin nations, also known as Ottawa. Now, Sanita is a very accomplished artist and cultural worker. She holds a PhD in cultural studies from Queen's University, where one of her projects was to articulate an artistic and political movement called Peasant Futurisms. And we're going to talk about that during the episode, and you'll learn a lot about this very interesting movement. And I love the way Sanita's work simultaneously explores the future, the past, and the present by grounding peasant ways of knowing, relating, and being in the world. I can relate to that, and maybe you can as well. In a way, we're all peasants, or at least we have the potential to be. You'll also hear Sanita talk about a new radio play for the National Arts Centre as part of their Irresistible Neighborhoods project. So here we go. Our conversation begins with her long journey from Sarajevo to Ottawa and concludes with a book recommendation, Rita Wong's Forage. Hey, Sanita, how are you?
Hi, Claude. I'm good. How are you?
We were just chatting earlier today, and I'm really happy to have you on the podcast because we've known each other for a while. You produced a theater play that I did some sound for, and we have had some projects together. And this is an opportunity to go a bit deeper about who you are, because people don't necessarily know you. So why don't we start there and get a bit of your background, where you're coming from, and then we'll talk about your work. And there's so much we could talk about. I think this is like the beginning of a conversation or a series of conversations.
Oh, yeah. I'll start with my background and then get into my work. So I am originally from Sarajevo, the capital of what used to be ex-Yugoslavia in southeast Europe. There was a siege in 1992 of my city and a genocide of my Muslim Bosnian people. I fled with my mother and brother. We were refugees in Croatia, and then we took a fisherman's boat and we crossed into Italy illegally. We then crossed a border illegally again into Switzerland, where I was a temporary guest, which is a status below refugee, a precarious status. I lived there for 5 years, and that's where I learned French. My father joined us. And then in 1997, we immigrated to Canada. So I came to Ottawa, the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe. And, I kind of integrated as best as I could. You go from growing up in a communist country, experiencing genocide, war, illegal border crossings, being a refugee, temporary guest, and finally you arrive in a democracy, a capitalist democracy where the individual reigns. So it took a little bit of time for me to adapt to this culture. And, I went through an education to become a good worker consumer. I bought my condo at 23. I had big investments. I had a degree in commerce. I had a child. I was able to live as I am here as a lesbian and in an uncompromising manner. Frankly, I was really happy, and at the same time there was a constant longing for a different way of being in the world that I couldn't put my finger on. So, when I had a series of really great jobs, actually. I was a communications manager and editor of Muse magazine for the Canadian Museums Association. Then I worked as the senior English editor for the Canadian Museum of History and the War Museum. So I had it set. I was an SE7 for Crown Corp. I knew that, I was only 24, that if I stayed there, I could probably move up and be a manager, retire at 50. Everything seemed sort of set. Yeah. And a few years later, after my son was born, I had a huge sort of spiritual crisis, in Renee Brown's words, a breakdown, because I was unhappy and I couldn't put my finger on why. And I realized that making money and buying the condo and having the investments and having the car was really compromising in a world where there was so much social and ecological instability. And I think it was my son's birth that made me realize that. And it all started with wanting to eat differently for me. And I wanted to feed him good food. I started doing research about what we were eating and industrial agriculture, etc. And I realized, my gosh, the context is so compromising, almost poisoned. Do you know what I mean? Toxic. And I did what any artist would do. I quit my well-paying, stable job that guaranteed a good life.
Well, a certain life anyway.
The definition of what is the commonly accepted as the good life, right? A certain kind of middle-class life. And I went back to school to get what I consider to be a real education. I did a degree in English. I did a master's in critical theory. And then I started to publish poetry. I published a novella. I was winning sort of prizes and awards. I started writing plays. My first play was staged at the GCTC last year, Blissful State of Surrender, 2022. So that was 2 years ago almost. Sorry, it's already 2024. And then I decided to do a PhD in cultural studies at Queen's. And this was a really important moment in my life. And I trace it back to that sort of spiritual crisis I was telling you about. Because as I was starting to get an education, I started to really understand the world I lived in. I was trying to ask myself the question in my PhD, rather than understanding how bad it is, the pollution, the climate crisis, the social emergency, colonialism, neoliberalism, and all of these things, including industrial agriculture and what that was doing to my plate. I was asking myself, well, what's the role of artists in all that? And that's where the PhD became really handy. And I started to articulate, almost by accident, an artistic movement. I was reading a lot of Afrofuturisms and Indigenous futurisms, and I was really inspired by these movements, and I don't know where it came from, maybe my ancestors, but I articulated what I call Peasant Futurisms. And it's a movement really that aims to demodernize and deindustrialize our way of life, our plates, and how we relate to our homesteads, the land we live on, and the food that we don't grow or grow. And that comes from Bosniak peasant traditions, because both my maternal and paternal grandparents were peasants, were mixed peasants. And my parents were the first generation to move to the city, get university degrees and master degrees. And so I was literally the first in my family to be born in a city. And I lost all of these knowledges, how to grow your own food, how to tend to orchards, how to cook in a way that is healthy. All of that wasn't available to me. And so I'm curious to know, how can art inspire us to maybe, not necessarily quit our jobs and become peasants, but relearn some of these traditions, like grow your own food in your backyard.
It's interesting because the timing is really good to have you on the show this season, because I'm looking at the end of the world as we know it, not the end of the world, but the end of the world as we know it, and the conditions to create other worlds, which is a quote from an article by the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures collective that I refer to often because they're so brilliant. And they just came up with new work last week. So there's this many sources of inspiration. And artists certainly inspire me because of their vision, but artists are also caught in the world in which we live, of consumption and capitalism, and so there's a dilemma for artists. How can we live in this world? How can we be artists when we're complicit, both if we're settlers, as settlers and all of that? But what I like, one of the many things I like about your work is that there's a poetry to it, right? A sense of lyricism through these very difficult and complex issues that draw us into a possible future. So maybe tell me more about the peasant futurism, because I'm intrigued. The word peasant to me it's like, oh, is that the right word? But I know it's a lived word for you, right? It's not like a class. It's more like a type, a way of living. But tell me more about peasant futurisms.
For me, it's the perfect word. Most people don't know that actually still today, peasants feed the majority of the world. And one of the things that I think is important to think about is that in its third definition, if you were to Google peasant, the third definition is boor, idiot, stupid, unclean. And so there's a sense of the pejorative, that the peasant is ineducated, that the peasant is a clown. And I think that's why a lot of people shy away from peasantry, when essentially, unless you, Claude, unless your family is noble and your ancestors are coming from nobility, at some point, maybe 4, 5, 6 generations ago, you are also a descendant of peasants. Because you're European, right? In Europe, you had nobility, you had peasants. Yes, you had a mercantile class. But the majority of people, myself included, are coming from peasants, and we've lost these knowledges. The promise was, at the turn of the 20th century, through rapid industrialization, post-1850, factories needed workers. So they created a lure for peasants to leave their homesteads, to leave their way of life, which is a way of life that's centered around, intersubjectivity between villagers who are helping each other, a way of life that's centered around attunement to the seasons, the needs of your farm animals, growing crop, taking care of orchards, gardens, etc., being truly self-sustainable and local, and frankly, not producing that much garbage. And of course, at that time, we didn't have the kinds of garbage that factory gave us and that we've inherited. But still, the lure was get out of the rural context, which is poor and it's hard work. And it is, manual labor is hard work. And being a peasant comes with certain risks. Weather becomes an important element of your life, something that we don't really have to think about being in the city. Because if you have hail in the summer and you lose your crops, then you really are threatened. What are you going to do for the winter, right? Hence the importance of community and neighbors and being intersubjective and helping each other. Well, these peasants were told, come into the city, get some wage labor, you'll have a car, you'll have freedom, it'll be exciting and sexy. But what happened was, essentially, you lost the ability to have access to your own land, the ability to grow your own food and be self-sustainable, to become essentially a cheap labor. And now you've become a worker consumer, and you're entangled in these webs of, international electronic waste cycles. Now I'm accelerating several hundreds of years. These narratives of progress that are always grounded in industrial progress, now digital progress. Endless growth on a planet that's actually dying in the context of a climate that's rising. I mean, look at the canal. It only opened 10 days this year, and last year not at all, So When I talk about peasant futurisms, I'm saying what would a future look like if we were to relearn some of the things that we lost in this sort of lure of progress, techno-digital progress? What if we were compelled through art? For me, it would be writing, but we could also have visual artists or musicians or sound artists who are listening to the more than human world. What if we were compelled to challenge capitalist cities made for cars and now suddenly cultivate a future where we have edible, wilder eco-cities surrounded by peasant food belts, where we have agroecology, regenerative farming practices, we're eating healthy, local, and our city is edible and wilder, and we can coexist with the more than human world, rather than think about trees or animals in terms of what kinds of services can they give us, and let's measure that in terms of money. How can we create relationships of reciprocity? And I think peasants were better at that. And this is a knowledge that does belong to, people like me, but also people like you, the majority of the world. Like I said, peasants still feed the majority of the world in Latin America and Africa and China. In China, they have peasant farmers. This is the way they grow their food primarily. In Eastern Europe, in Bosnia, where I'm from, that's still the case. And so instead of, maybe stealing indigenous traditions, which I see a lot of settlers do, what if we turned to our own heritage and started digging for the treasures that are there?
Well, it sounds like socialism to me, but the words escape, right? Because whether you call it community life or socialism, or it's essentially cooperation and living as nature and not with nature, right? Because we are not part of nature, and that disconnect, I think, is at a source of all of our issues, or most of them, because we've lost our way as beings, and we need to reconnect with what keeps us alive, which is not just food, but relationships with all living beings. So I keep hearing that again and again, and that it does give me a little bit of hope that whichever living beings will survive the coming difficulties, they will discover within themselves something that's already there, that's been masked, that's been corrupted, and they can come back to being in harmony with the earth and live and die in a natural cycle. I'm interested in your work as an artist, because you mentioned that you're writing a play here in Ottawa about enacting in a way, because it's a lovely theory, right? It's easy to write theories, but it's more than a theory for you. It's like something you're doing, right? So maybe tell me about a practical artistic application of some of the things you're working on.
I'm presently working on 3 projects concurrently: a book of poetry, a graphic novel, and I'm writing a play for the National Arts Centre, tentatively titled Machines and Moss. And it's part of a project called Irresistible Futures. And, the NAC sort of put out a call to local playwrights to try to imagine an irresistible future from the point of view of their specific neighborhoods. So I'm from Vanier. And some people may know, people from Vanier certainly know, but Vanier was built on over 80 landfills. The company that built the Alexandria Bridge that connects us to Hull, which was my old workplace, the Canadian Museum of History, they took all the toxins that they used to build that bridge and they dumped it in Vanier, because that's where they were situated. And Vanier then became sort of also a garbage dump for Ottawa, because Vanier used to be its own city. It used to be its own francophone city with working class francophone folks living there. 2001 amalgamated to Ottawa as part of that grand amalgamation, if you remember. And, every year I receive this large yellow letter telling me there are microcontaminants in the air. I've got lead, copper, mercury in the soil and in the air. And the letter says things like, make sure that if you have small children that they're not, sort of touching the soil or eating it, which of course impacts me greatly because I've got a toddler. My baby was born in Vanier, and she's 2 now. I also have a big 13-year-old, so I always think about her, and I try to tell her, don't touch the soil, don't touch the soil. And I remember once we planted a rose bush, and we found Coca-Cola bottles and other bits of garbage, and it was just, it wasn't even just like, it was maybe 2 feet deep. So I thought about that a lot, and my play imagines future Vanier, where in 2026 an earthquake cracks open the soil, and this lead and mercury, and sort of the thing that's under the surface, all that garbage, that wasteland that you and I are talking about, that we can see and sense, it becomes palpable for people because it's now in the air. And this earthquake sort of precipitates an explosion with a nuclear plant near Ottawa, so Ottawa becomes a new Chernobyl. People have evacuated, but a bunch of hardcore Vanniers have negotiated city-state status. This is all background for my play. The play begins with the main character, who is known as a Pleasant, and that's because the people who survived here after post-apocalypse, they became peasants. They grew their own food. They worked with the trees, and there's this mutation that happened because of all this contamination. They grew fungi and moss on the soles of their feet, and they started to commune and literally could hear and talk with plants and trees. And so with the moss now taking over their skin, they're half plant, half human, so they're pleasants. They're known as pleasants. And in 2052, the world wants to come back to Ottawa and rebuild. And they have the technology to decontaminate quicker. And so they've come back and they're trying to negotiate with these pleasants to re-amalgamate to Ottawa. And there's a clash of two worlds. On the one hand, you have these plant peasants, these people who have communed and literally become one with the more than human world, right? On the other hand, you have the future. In 2052, the world has gone more digital. People now have these AIs, A-E-Y-E, like eyes, and they've implanted chips in their eyes. And so they're half digital. They're pretty much cyborgs, right? Everyone's done this. And they can, kind of like having the internet inside your body, right? They can get their money this way. They know the world through technology. They're literally become technology. And, you know, it's a post-fossil fuel world, Claude, okay? And
in a good way?
It's a post-fossil fuel world. This company, these quantum technology, right? Quantum technology inside your body. Quantum technology has cleaned up fossil fuels. Everything is clean. But these people are disconnected from the natural world anyway, right? You can create technology that's clean. You don't have to, you can stabilize the climate, but that doesn't mean you're living in a respectful manner with the more than human world. That doesn't mean that you don't actually realize that you are also natural, that you are nature, not that nature can create services for you that are worth X amount of bitcoins. And so these pleasants and these humans with their AIs, they have to negotiate a way to rebuild Ottawa. And that's the drama of my play. It assumes that we have two potential futures. The future of becoming more natural or the future of becoming more machine. And what are we going to choose, Claude, right? Because a lot of people are obsessed with, let's be post-fossil fuel. Let's just stabilize the environment. But that doesn't mean the species are going to continue to live. Because what are you doing with that technology? Because what we have on top of a climate crisis is we have a human crisis. What does it mean to be human? And that's what I'm dramatizing in this play. I'm not going to tell you what happens or how they negotiate the future, but I'm dramatizing this, and I'm not making it facile. I'm not saying the plant peasants or the pleasants are the winners and that's the only way to go, right? That the future has to be peasant. I'm saying the future is already going in a certain direction, and it's a corporate direction. It's the direction of what I call the compulsory digitization of life, where everything is becoming more digital, how we understand ourselves, how we meet people, how we communicate, how we create social bonds. We can't live without this technology anymore. But that technology does have an impact.
So we've been talking about art, and you and I were both involved in an organization that still exists called SCALE, the Sectoral Climate Arts Leadership for the Emergency, which is a very important organization because we are in a climate emergency, and arts and culture is playing, because there's so many films and books and gestures being made. But what are your thoughts on the role of the arts, because there are multiple points of impact, but more specifically, what artists today, you're an artist, I'm an artist, many of the people listening to this podcast are artists, could and should be doing in relation not only to the climate emergency, but the human crisis that you talked about?
I think artists are best situated to shake up our understanding of ourselves and our place in the world, right? Because often we're caught up in just trying to survive the world, right? You got to pay rent. You got to put food on the table. You got to make choices about your family. You got your health. You got to get from A to B. You get home at night, got to feed the kids, put the kids to bed. You're exhausted. Maybe you have time for a book. Maybe you have time on the weekend to go to the museum or see a movie or go see a play, right?
Or listen to a podcast.
Or listen to this podcast. Of course, as you're driving, as you're working out, or just listening to it peacefully as you're mindful about the words that are coming in. Artists now can help us not only to see the world we're in, therefore to maybe illuminate our blind spots, illuminate the fact that, most of the food we're eating is toxic. It's degrading soil. Within the next 50 years, we're not going to have living soil if we continue at the pace we're living. We're going to have multiple food baskets. We're going to be competing to buy food at the grocery store because corporations have infantilized us into dependence for food, when we could be taking this time to learn how to plant seeds in our backyards, on our rooftops, on our balconies if we're living in a condo, and actually start in some way to gain control over what we eat as a strategy, not only to mitigate potential breadbasket failures, but also to create more beautiful cities, eco-cities, edible cities, etc. And imagine seeing an image of an edible and wilder eco-city and the inspiration that can give you. Imagine seeing a play where you actually see that enacted. I think artists can challenge us by, like I said, showing our blind spots, in a way educating us, but also inspiring us about what's possible, right? I think in Scale, we talk about reauthoring the world. That's what artists do. We reauthor the world. We create alternative ways of even just thinking about what's desirable in the first place. And they challenge us about who we are. You could say, look, I'm Sanita, I'm a human being. Nature is something out there beyond my skin. It's a mute background until it's like hailing and there's a fire. Or I can say, actually, this thing that I call Sanita, this body that I call Sanita, is 70% water. Water is not out there. Water is me. I am a body of water. I'm more water than I am anything else. Well, this thing that I call human is like, I have more non-human bacteria in my body than I have human cells. At least the same or more. That's what they're saying. There are more non-human agents inside of me than what I call human flesh, right? So how can I say nature is out there, right? What's happening is that I'm completely embedded in and transcorporeal with the natural world. I'm continuous with it. And if I drink poisoned water and if I eat a poisoned food every day, and that becomes my bone and my flesh, am I dwelling in health? So I am absolutely responsible for the food on my plate, for the soil that I call elsewhere. I'm responsible for that. But then we're getting into really, really sticky stuff because artists can inspire us. But then, art is also, when it's doing things like that, when it's doing important social ecological work, it's also immediately political. Because, there will have to be a battle. And there is a battle right now for what are we doing? And people think, oh my God, it's so big. Where do I start? It does feel overwhelming, right? Well, maybe we can start with our backyard. Maybe we can start with the plate. And that's why I think Peasant Futurisms is exciting.
Mm-hmm. And I agree that local, regional impact is powerful, but also international connections are important we break the isolation, which is partially why I started this podcast, 4 years ago. But I was a bit naive at the beginning because I really thought that art could play a role in raising awareness, and it does, of course, right? I've seen so many things and experienced them, but that's not enough. It's not enough, and I remember hearing someone on the radio saying artists need to play a dual role of raising awareness and using their skills as activists and social interveners because they're good at that. But that puts a lot of pressure on the artist. You talked about, the challenge of everyday life, right? And making a living as an artist is very difficult. So I don't want to put too much pressure on the back of the artist, but I know that they have skill sets that society needs right now. So not only do we need more art is good, generally good, but we need more artists and people working in the cultural field. And maybe that's where it happens locally, is that people who are artisans and who are doing really good local work just keep doing it and are encouraged to connect and to grow, so that we don't necessarily have an elite, only an elite layer of professional artists, which is good. You know, I worked at the Canada Council after all, you know, we fund great artists. But everybody participates in this sense of collective, creative reimagining of the world, which is essential for our survival. And so it's not a question of nice to have. It's like essential that we become the artisans that we are. We become the nature that we are, and take away the barriers for that to happen. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I mean, also, like, that begs the question, who is an artist, right?
Who is an artist?
Yeah. You know, really, to be an artist is to be a creator. And I would include people in culinary arts, right? Farmers. I think they're extraordinary artists. And we all are responsible for our aesthetic of being, which is, how do we show up in the world? Are we showing up present? A nod to your podcast, but also an honest question. Are we present, or are we victims and villains? Because it's a triad, right? Sometimes we're victims, sometimes we're villains. Are we villains if we're eating and, you know, all this toxic food that's mass produced? But no, we're not. We're not villains, because it's very expensive to grow your own food. It's very expensive to support local organic farmers. Who can afford to go to the farm, right? What we need is extraordinary, huge structural social change, political change. The role of the artist is to light a fire, light that spark, to just burn a bit of the old and make space for the new, and even potentially create visions of what we want once we are working towards the new. The role of the artist is not the same as the role of a politician. It's not the same as the role of an architect. But if I create a play that's embedded in what I call peasant aesthetics, so that peasant futurism movement, then maybe there will be a politician who looks at my work and is like, listen, this is really important. How would we build an edible wilder eco-city surrounded by peasant food belts so that we can have local cyclical economies, right? Whether those economies are eco-social or not, preferably they would be, right? You know, worker-led unions and stuff like that, but irrelevant. I create the vision, I light a fire in the old, I punch a hole in the lie, and that way the architect can now think about, how would I build a house that's sort of edible, that would have a green rooftop or a green wall? How would I build a house like that? Then you have, you know, sort of the city planner working towards that, and the politician. Because the role of the artist is unique. He cannot actually create anything, he or she or they cannot create anything without that community of others, right? And so peasant futurisms may be an artist movement, but certainly it's for everybody. And I don't think we can have a future that's healthy, let's put it that way, socially, ecologically healthy, a future that's regenerative, without everybody participating.
I like to end the podcast with any recommended readings or books or podcasts or things that have inspired you that you think others would benefit from. Does anything come to mind that you would recommend people check out?
Well, it's not recent. I've been reading Rita Wong's work for a while. She's a Canadian poet she's a Chinese-Canadian poet, sorry. And she wrote a book, two books of poetry that I deeply recommend. One of them is called Forage, and the other one is called Undercurrents. And I think, first of all, that the poetry is accessible. You can read it and know what is being written. The images are gorgeous. The language is fresh. But these two books really opened up my mind about two things. In Forage, we learn about the impact of our electronics in, small villages in China. We realize that e-waste is incredibly damaging to the planet, but also the people who are then caught up in trying to clean it up, to collect those little bits of pieces of those minerals that are worth something. And so I think that book is essential for everybody, because who doesn't have a phone and a laptop and an iPad and headphones and this and that? And once I read that book, I kept my last phone for 8 years. I invested so much money in repairing it that I could have bought another new phone, but I didn't. that was eye-opening. And what I love about poetry, and the reason I recommend it, Claude, is it's not necessarily a popular medium, but I mean, you can go to the bathroom and read a poem. Do you know what I mean? Like, you could keep poems in your bathroom. It's that easy. It's lovely. It's fast. It's gorgeous. And what I love about, so that was Forage, and what I love about Undercurrents, the central image of being undercurrent, right? Not going with the flow of, the corporate flow of our lives, but the undercurrent, the underbelly of that resistance, whether that's growing your own food or leaning in towards health or a slower way of life, challenging colonialism or whatever it is that you're doing that's the undercurrent of the mainstream. What I loved about that book was that it really made me realize that as settlers in a Canadian context, we can walk with other people as allies. And that's what Rita Wong does. She's walking with Indigenous people. She's been arrested for doing that kind of work. So she's one of those artists that you talked about, artist, activist, and teacher. And those two books really changed my life because there was this one poem, and it's a list poem. It's a really easy poem, and if you don't mind, I want to talk a little bit about it. And there's 2 columns, and she's trying to see what words we recognize. And I don't remember if it's the left or the right, but on one side, you have words for like different species of trees and plants. And, I'm trying to see what I know. And on the other side, you have corporate words like apple, blackberry, apple and blackberry meaning the corporation.
Words, yeah.
And it was crazy. I realized from this one poem that I knew more words to that corporations really created a dictionary. I knew their words, but I didn't know the words for the plants that coexist with me, that give me my air, without whom I could not exist. It was just extraordinary. You know what I mean? And so I do recommend these, first of all, because of the accessibility. So easy. It takes a few minutes to read a poem, but also because they just open up new worlds and tell you a lot about yourself.
And Sanita, we could go on, but we will stop here and respect our listeners' time. Je voulais aussi mentionner qu'on va avoir une conversation en français, donc ceux qui sont francophones, il y a le balado conscient, on va avoir une émission avec Sanita en français bientôt. Thanks so much for your time and your commitment to, humans and more than humans. I think it's beautiful to hear you speak with your passion and your calm also, because that's a big part, I think, of facing our future, is to remain calm, to remain grounded, to face reality, and to do something meaningful, and then to trust that all these dots will be connected.
Mm-hmm. Ground yourself like the trees. Thank you, Claude.
Cheers.
Cheers.